the recording. And so I'm really pleased to introduce our first panelist, who's Onalia Osei from Maastricht University, and she's going to be talking about her research looking at overcoming interruptions in educational trajectories for youth in Ghana with international migrant parents. Onalia, you've got 3 to 4 minutes just to summarize your key ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And I'm also glad to be here. This is also my first time at the DSA conference, so it's nice to meet all of you working in education, migration, and development. So yeah, let me move straight to my page. I think, as we all know, when parents leave origin countries to stay in host or destination countries, sometimes some of them are unable to move their children with them, so these young people stay back home. And so there are so many scholars in migration development Nexus literature who talk about how so-called left behind, or others call them stayers, are able to benefit from the international migration of others. The existing literature has shown that parent migration can positively or negatively impact on the academic achievements or performance of their children who are left behind. These young people are left behind, and so the concept of left behind often connotes some negative implications, which therefore leads to a lot of results which show the detrimental impact of parental migration on such young people. So in our research, we decided to go more in line with the stayer, which means that we try to overcome all the negative connotations, or try to actually avoid whatever assumptions that being in that state could mean. And by so doing, we are able to use the youth-centric approach, unlike most of the existing literature, which place migrant parents and caregivers at the center of their investigation, so that they could see how these adults impact the educational experiences of the young people. We, on the other side, with sort of a counter approach, is to put the young people at the center and front of our analysis and investigation, and thereby unpack how they experience all kinds of changes in their educational trajectories and how they try to overcome them. So in so doing, we have different cases with different socioeconomic backgrounds, but we decided to use the trajectory approach, which permits us to see all kinds of changes, and thereby trying to use the extreme cases to project how young people experience parental migration in the course of their educational trajectories and how they try to overcome the extreme hurdles that I talked about in my presentation. So what we found by relying on the existing migration literature, but also what the general education literature says, is that youth who are at risk of dropping out during parental migration experience interruptions, but they try to overcome these interruptions by activating their agency through various social networks. And in this case, we were able to see that they take advantage of other intergenerational and intra-generational support networks within their locality to complement what migrants' parents do for their education. But in other cases, we see that there is a lack of transnational support, and therefore these people fully rely on local social network support to still overcome their interruptions so that they can be able to reach the desirable goal of completing high school. So in so doing, our argument is that, like I think in the other panel we learned, it is important to look at the transnational social sphere, but more also the local context, so that we can be able to unpack how all of these interactions support the lives of migrants as well as the stayers, hence the kinds of achievements they are able to make in their developmental trajectories. So I think I would end here. I hope I didn't take too much time. But I look forward to your comments and questions.
That was great. That was really, really helpful. And I'm sure we'll have some questions for you in a moment. I want to move on now to our second panelist, who's Sugandha Nagpal from OP Jindal Global University. And she's going to be talking about her research looking at educated middle-class identities in the context of immobility among young Dalit women in Punjab, India. Sugandha, are you there? Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Amy. It's really nice to finally see you and Elaine. So my presentation is drawing on a chapter that will be in fact published in Education, Migration and International Development, Critical Perspectives in a Moving World, which is edited by Amy and Elaine. In this presentation, as you might have watched, I'm discussing the educational experiences of young Dalit women between the ages of 18 and 35, residing in a predominantly Dalit village in rural Punjab with a strong culture of migration. So this paper is drawing on literature and anthropology and development and trying to probe the importance of education in a context where migration is the main pathway to mobility and education does not lead to certain intended mobility outcomes. For instance, the young Dalit women are pursuing undergraduate and postgraduate education with the aim of physically and culturally moving away from the village space through international migration as well as government employment. But given their historical disadvantages accruing due to their caste status, they don't have access to very high quality education. They often lack economic resources and strong social networks. And as a result, these outcomes are often unlikely or take a very long time to pan out. As these young women wait in the village space, they draw on ideas of educatedness to construct middle-class identities. The middle-class ethos is one that is defined by movement outside the village to aspirational spaces in the West and urban local spaces. It's seen as something that enhances status and is distinctive from the backward lower classes. How young women are able to use education to construct this middle-class identity is shaped by their family's social and economic position. So young women, for instance, from more secure and educated middle-class families, wherein I defined educated middle-class families as where the father is employed in a government job, these young women are able to draw on their educational status to carve a distinctive identity, dissociate from the village space, and claim proximity to an urbanized or modern idea of female mobility. In contrast, young women from less secure middle-class families, while also invested in claiming belonging to spaces outside the village, are negotiating access to education and further employment, and are unable to use their educational status to carve a distinctive identity to the same extent. So I'll stop here and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Sugandha. That was great, and that was really helpful. We'll hold on questions now and go on to our next panelist, who is Seb Brumsby from the University of Warwick. And he's going to be talking about his research investigating the two-tier global migration regime through the lens of the experiences of Vietnamese students and undocumented migrants to the UK. Seb, over to you.
Thanks very much. So great to be in this panel. I'm a political scientist, so I'm not so much interested in, well, I wasn't until recently so much interested in education or migration per se, but rather the kind of national and international power structures and what we can learn about them through these different lenses. As Amy's already said, the case study is looking at Vietnamese migration to the UK, which was made famous or infamous a few years ago in the UK by a terrible tragedy where 39 undocumented migrants were found dead in the back of a lorry, which they were trying to use to cross into the border, into the UK. And so, yeah, I've been doing some field work within the Vietnamese community here. And I wasn't really interested so much in this comparison between undocumented migrants and student migrants until one of my research informants pointed out that basically it costs the same either way to get here. Either you're a privileged student who pays £30,000 for a master's degree at Warwick Business School and all the other associated fees with it, or you pay £30,000, £50,000 to various migration brokers to get you into the country via illicit means. So I was really kind of struck by this, that, you know, the difference between literally life and death potentially, but also, yes, the kind of hardship that goes along with these kind of undocumented migration routes is not even just wealth, because these undocumented or irregular migrants from rural regions of central Vietnam, they find ways of getting the money. You know, they go into huge amounts of debts. Often whole family networks will sell land or borrow money on their behalf. So there's obviously a lot of pressure that comes with that as well. But the difference is not money, but class in this situation. And so, yeah, in my video, I looked a little bit at the features of the different migrant groups, and how, especially with the irregular migrants from this kind of underdeveloped, stagnant region of central Vietnam, they often dropped out of education early. Higher education was seen as a dead end, because in the end, it wasn't going to help you get the job because you didn't have the right social connections and networks, which that all comes through class in the Vietnam context. And then, yeah, I kind of had a quick look at the kind of trajectories where they end up in the UK. And actually, even though students from high class backgrounds have a much easier time and safer time, they also find that they end up being discriminated against in the UK and don't find a kind of easy pathway into better employment than the undocumented migrants necessarily. So that's also interesting. But yeah, the kind of my thesis was that the UK higher education system has kind of allied with the kind of higher class strata in Vietnam, which kind of reinforces privilege. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Seb. Really interesting. I now want to go to our final panelist, who is Louise York from the University of Cambridge. And she's going to be talking about her research in Ethiopia, looking at rural female migrants negotiating domestic work and secondary education in urban Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So thank you to Elaine and Amy for organizing this panel. I really enjoyed all the other presentations, and I just found it fascinating to see some of the connections across the different presentations. So my work was based on my PhD research, which I carried out at Trinity College Dublin before my current role. And my PhD began with a more general focus on girls' education. And I was very much interested in kind of looking at international and national dialogue around empowering girls through education and how this actually linked with the experiences of girls' lives. And particularly looking at rural girls who were least likely to benefit from education. So I undertook some preliminary research, and it was really through this preliminary research, going to schools and different communities, that this issue of migration really emerged. So it wasn't the initial focus of my PhD, but then it just became one of the center points. So I looked at a sample of rural girls. There was 27 in total who had already reached urban areas. And this paper in particular looks at a subsample of these rural migrants. And they were working as domestic workers in urban households, and they were enrolled in what are called in the context of Ethiopia as night school. So this wasn't the regular day school that other students were attending. It was a class in the evening, and they were purposely designed for students who are more disadvantaged as a means for them to be able to combine work and education. And they were predominantly made up of female rural migrants. But the quality of education that was available in these night schools was really poor for a number of reasons, including limited access to electricity, and this was at nighttime, so they couldn't continue, limited access to resources, and also just the limited time they had. So I was interested in kind of understanding their experiences, both why they wanted to leave their rural communities, how they did this, and what their experiences were in urban areas. So in terms of their experiences in the rural areas, it really emerged through the through the research that it was the intersection of gender and economic inequalities that really led to significant disadvantages in their lives. And it was really the sense that marriage was the only option for them. So many of them would attend primary school, but once they had completed, it would marriage would only be the only option for them. Also, due to kind of the intersection of gender and economic inequalities, they had really heavy domestic work burden. So they would have to compensate for the limited resources in their communities, and they were working, doing different activities from morning to evening. So within this context, all of the participants really viewed education as a key to kind of escape these inequalities. And migration was really necessary for them to be able to continue their education. So this was kind of really interesting dynamics. Within this kind of subsample of relatively more disadvantaged girls, I found it really interesting that domestic work, which was really disadvantaging them in terms of their education in the rural areas, then enabled them to migrate to the urban areas, and to access their education. So because of their low socioeconomic status, if they hadn't have engaged in this domestic work, they wouldn't have been able to migrate. Another key point was the role of social networks in their migration. So often for some girls, social networks were the first to initiate, so to present the idea of migrating to the urban area, and they really helped to facilitate their migration and also to establish them in the city. And without this support, many girls struggled in the city. But in turn, this really led to great power imbalances between the social network members and the girls. And once they arrived in the city, many had believed that they would be attending regular day school, but once they had arrived, they were forced, let's say, to attend night school, and they were given really heavy domestic work burdens, again, in the urban areas. So I guess overall what this study really demonstrated was that the parents or the participants, even though they were accessing education and they had migrated, they were still disadvantaged in the city, but at the same time, they believed that staying in the urban area was better than returning to the rural area. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. I thought it was a really rich and fascinating group of papers in this panel that through all of you drawing on kind of different forms of qualitative research really draw out some of the complexity of this migration education nexus. And I mean, a theme that seemed to be running through all the papers in different ways was some of the tensions between the different forms of mobility and immobility linked to spatial mobility, but also social, educational, economic mobility. And looking at that from the perspectives both of those who move, but also those who stay. I thought there's some really interesting themes coming out as well around, we talked about this in the first panel, about around those intersections with issues of gender and class inequalities and how those play out in relation to experiences of migration and education, but also how they might be reshaped through those processes. And then a focus on agency as well in negotiating some of those relationships. I think another theme coming through then was, and Louise just mentioned it now, was the significance of the different kinds of forms of social networks and how those play out in experiences of migration, but also education. And then, of course, the significance and the complexity of context in relation to these experiences. And it was really fascinating to hear from four really quite different contexts. I think there's probably lots to discuss. So I want to open it up to questions now. Annika, I can see you've raised your hand.
I've got questions for everybody. I don't know if I can ask, I can try and be really succinct and ask a question of everybody, and then thank you. I just loved all the presentations so much. So Analia, yeah, really fascinating. And the idea of stayers, I really like that concept. And it kind of touches sort of things that I've worked on myself. Valentina Mazzucato, I know Valentina. When I finally realized that migration was very relevant to education in Senegal and we organized an event, she was the keynote speaker. So there's that nice link there. And she asked a question during our workshop, which I think I'm going to throw the question back at you and ask the same question. But she said, we've got to think carefully about the categories of analysis that we use in our research and whether those categories might not sort of impose certain conclusions. And in particular, this concept of stayer youth, by focusing just on them and their experiences, I wonder if this might mask the similarities that there could be between stayer youth and other youth who aren't living with their parents, or, you know, single parent households or orphans, or youth who aren't necessarily living with their parents, you know, in a fosterage kind of situation. Because I can imagine that there might be quite a few similarities there. So is there a risk that by just focusing on stayer youth, we miss the possible similarities that they might have with other categories of youth? And we're not overemphasizing this experience as being just an experience of stayer youth and linked to migration, when it can be maybe linked to broader cultural kinship setups, or, you know, just socio-economic phenomena in the Ghanaian context. So that was that question about categories. Seb, I found this presentation absolutely brilliant and fascinating, and it's a set of stories that I'd never sort of really heard before, particularly like the juxtaposition between them. And, you know, it really problematizes, you know, these whole discourses about the global knowledge economy and, you know, human capital theories of education. So it's so important, you know, to tell these stories and like the differences between these two groups, but also these really quite harrowing similarities. And I liked how you know, nuanced this idea of class as being about money, but also networks and capital, which links in really well to Suganda's presentation. But I just wondered, like, quite a simple question, like, what do you hope to do with these findings? You know, what are the implications of these findings, and what would you like to see differently? I don't know, in research, in policy, in media discourses, what would you like to do with these amazing findings? And then Suganda's presentation, that blue house with the eagle on top. I mean, how conspicuous is that? I thought that was an incredible image that says so much. You mentioned the term respectability, I think once, around minute 15. And I was surprised that you didn't talk about respectability and honor more, because a lot of the literature that I've read about, in the Indian subcontinent kind of context, and I found also very useful for thinking through dynamics in Senegal, how useful the term respectability and honor are for studying these intersections between class, caste, and gender and education. So I kind of wondered, are the notions of respectability and honor changing or shifting within the dialect community over time as a result of, you know, their changing socioeconomic status? Or do young women able to kind of play on these constructions? So maybe if by having a certain kind of education or spending a lot of time outside the home, if that challenges local notions of respectability, are there other ways that they could kind of compensate by, you know, having a more demure sort of habitus? Or so I'd like to hear more about this concept of respectability and honor in this context. And finally, Louise, I research on female migration, especially child female migration internal to the African continent, is such an under-researched issue. So I was like, wow, this is so fascinating, especially, you know, domestic workers kind of angle. And I really liked your analysis, like using the idea of empowerment, but a very sensitive understanding of empowerment. And I wondered, because a lot of studies aren't so sensitive, and I feel that with the term empowerment, there's so much risk that kind of researchers or policymakers impose what they consider to be empowering, and that can really shape an analysis. So I wondered if, you know, you've seen that in your kind of literature reviews, or how you tried to kind of avoid that in your own research. That I'd be interested to know. But yes, thank you so much. for letting me ask all these questions.
Thanks, Annika. I can see Suganda's also got her hand up. So I wonder if we just take your question to Suganda and then we can go round to everybody to give responses.
Sure, thank you. So my question is to Luis. I was just wondering in terms of, so what and I may have misunderstood something, so just a clarification as well. But so the ways in which you're talking about migration here is that it's both a way of escaping inequalities, but then there's also a rehashing of inequality and the way in which education does not lead to certain intended outcomes. But I was also wondering, I mean, again, sort of drawing on my own experiences, whether there was also a way in which these girls and young women talked about the transformative potential of education, even when it doesn't lead to certain outcomes. So I was wondering whether your data spoke to that at all or what you found on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suganda. So should we just do a quick kind of round of responses? If we start with Onalia, because that was the first question was to you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Annika, thank you very much for your question, and I will let Valentina know that I met you here. It's good to know that you once had such a meeting with her. And yes, I think the whole Montreal project, which is the project, the bigger ERC funded project Valentina is doing right now, has 4 PhDs on it. 3 were looking at the European cases, which is about children of migrants who live here with their parents. And then I was looking at those who stayed behind. And the logic was to understand from my case, to really try and unpack the experiences of those who actually lived in Ghana before they joined their parents, as well as trying to build on the literature that talks about stayer youth who are unable to join their parents and still live in the origin country. And so by taking this approach of perspective, it means that categories are really important to us, and we really want to unpack how categories can be understood, by showing several complexities. And by so doing, in talking about this, although I can talk about how class, gender, and other factors impact the kinds of observations we had, but just by going beyond the assumption that if you are left behind, then you are vulnerable, it actually positioned these young people in a very passive status as compared to other young people within Ghana and around the world. And we all know how young people, due to globalization, modernity, aspirations, shaped by various factors that you also talk about in your video, are helping people all around the world, even in villages within Africa and elsewhere in Asia, to look beyond their locality. So it's with all of these assumptions that we try to understand, especially for these stayer youth, although I have data about the other non-migrant children, but for stayer youth, we critically gave them the time. So if you really listen to my methodology, I don't go so much into it, but the method was such that we gave them ample time, and I call it collaborative reflexivity. So with time and with back and forth engagement, they are able to process their experience and their aspirations and expectations, but specifically in relation to parental migration, so that they themselves can unpack things. And with critical follow-ups and conversations, interviews, we are able to underline the specific factors that shape their life through parental migration. Hence, taking advantage of the time that they are also able to reflect on their experiences and aspirations, show forth their agency, and then we just pick on the things that they say and try to see how the literature can help us develop this body of literature. So I think this sort of gives you a broader perspective about what the Montreal project is doing, but also how this paper has been shaped the way it is. But again, thanks.
Thank you so much, Analia. Seb, can we turn to you now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Anika. It's still early days. I should say that this is very much kind of preliminary analysis based on basically just a couple of my interviews. I've got more data that I'm still analyzing, but I'm interested, I guess, what I hope to do with this data. I can think of a couple of things where it might be relevant. First, in terms of like the UK current kind of continuing hostile environment for migrants in general, but also like with the new kind of problems that we're seeing with Brexit and like huge demands for like low skill labor, low skill quote unquote, where British citizens aren't up for doing it and stuff. And so when I asked my participants what do they want, they said, well, we'd be very happy to pay for a temporary work visa here, work for a few years, make some money and go back. That'd be much better than paying these brokers and this crazy dangerous journeys we're doing. So kind of a critique of the current UK visa system and beyond. But also I want to critique the kind of neoliberal academy in the UK, which we've seen, it's in universities are increasingly being turned into kind of money-making institutions, and the whole, recruitment of international students for exorbitant fees is a massive part of that. I'm sure it's not just Vietnam where there's this alliance between higher education and higher classes. And so I think there's a couple of avenues, but that I could go down. But like I said, it's very preliminary at the moment.
Thanks so much, Seb. Suganda, can I turn to you now?
Yes. Thank you so much for the question, Annika. So this, it's a very good question and ties into some of the other work so this is based on my PhD work. So there was an entire chapter on how young women are performing mobility. And in that, I've interrogated this idea of respectability a little bit more, but I think you've kind of, in your question itself, I found, this idea of respectability is within this particular community very tied to ideas of class. So it is about, how do we, so respectability is constructed in terms of rural norms, and how do you then navigate those rural norms while fashioning an urbanized, educated, middle-class identity. So it is this reworking of things where, you'll uptake of certain fashions, clothing, food, where you're able to position yourself as straddling these two worlds. And it also differed based on how these young women were positioned. So those from, for example, which I also mentioned in the chapter, so from secure middle-class families, so someone like Somika was a lot more comfortable adorning urban fashions within the village space, as opposed to someone like Kavita, who was only would say that those fashions are for spaces outside the village. So, young women that were in a more secure position were able to sort of embody that kind of urbanized identity a lot more within the village space, and that came forth in the food, clothing, and young women from less secure families were a lot more careful about this balancing act that they were carrying out. So there is, and I think that you might be onto something in the sense of, your question, and this is something that I've also been thinking about respect to a lot of other people's work in South Asia, looking at young women, that there is something that is shifting. There is a greater focus on class mobility, and that as the basis for thinking through gender norms. So I think in some ways, this idea of honor, of course it exists, but it is being actively reworked. So I wouldn't use the term honor because that's not something, people didn't talk about shame and honor in that sense, but there was a way of trying to be respectable or abiding by certain rural norms. So I think, there is something shifting, but something to be analyzed and thought about a lot more. But thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Suganda. I want to give Louise a chance to answer the two questions asked of her, and then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes at the end for Seb's question. I've seen you want to ask one too, Seb. So Louise.
So thank you very much for the two really interesting questions. I'll try to be quick so there's more time for more questions, but so I guess this idea of empowerment is something that I was really interested in looking at. And I mean, we've all seen this huge international push for girls' education, and particularly at the national level in Ethiopia. within even the government's development strategy, girls' education is kind of placed within there. And it's this idea that we can get girls into school and this will empower them. I think it actually says to leave behind their traditional roles and pursue more modern futures. So it's really this idea that let's get girls into school, and this will have this kind of trickle down empowerment where we empower communities and families. So I really wanted to look at the reality of what this means. And I found the case of the domestic workers really, really interesting, because I was also looking at kind of the labour policy and what was available in terms of protection of domestic workers. And within families, in Ethiopia, having a domestic worker is very, very common, but there is no protection, there's no labour laws there to protect domestic workers. And it's very much this idea of domestic workers are part of a family, and that in introducing a law would thereby kind of destroy this family-like relationship. So it's very much, it was very much a case of kind of looking at what empowerment means. It was very this liberal idea of just getting girls into school, increasing participation, but in terms of protecting girls in other ways, that really wasn't there. And especially for the night school, there was very little focus, policy, or practice. There was very little attention given to the quality of night school and what this really meant. So it was very much a case of looking critically at this. And then I guess a second layer of looking at this idea of empowerment is what empowerment really means, and kind of looking through this framework of looking at resources and agency and achievements. Do resources always have a positive impact, or are resources contradictory in some ways? Like through the social networks, we really seen this. And also an agency, like the girls really are demonstrating huge agency, but this is really bounded by the structural inequalities that they're coming up against. So yeah, I feel like I could probably talk a lot more about that whole idea of empowerment. But then just to move quickly to Suganda's question, it was really sad in a way that the girls had really overcome all these barriers and had reached secondary education, but they weren't really able to benefit. But it was then also really interesting that they still held on to this idea that in the future they could still empower themselves through education. So even some of them in the interviews, they talked about completing their education as night students and then going back and beginning their secondary education again, and trying to kind of achieve better outcomes by attending the day school. But in terms of the other ways that it had transformed their lives, like all of the participants, both in the subsample and the wider sample, had talked about how if they hadn't have migrated and they hadn't have been in school, they would be married and they would have children by now. So I guess that was really the benefit that they've seen from kind of staying in the communities. So yeah, I'll stop there, but thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much, Louise. Seb, do you want to quickly ask your question to Suganda?
Yes, please. Sorry, it's probably a really ignorant question as well, because I'm not that familiar with the context, but I'm just interested in the kind of overlap between class and caste, because obviously your research sample was about the Dalit community. And so I was wondering, you know, do kind of more educated middle-class Dalit women kind of lose their Dalitness? Like, for example, your example of Somika, who seemed to be one of those ones who could kind of cut her ties with the village. Do the village still consider her like one of them? Do people from the city still consider her an outsider? And what does she think about her identity is my quick question.
And that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, so I couldn't get into that within this particular presentation, but so the young women that are trying to sort of carve these middle class identities, a part of that is also trying to move the site of pollution or Dalitness from themselves to the lower class villagers. So class mobility has become a tool to then dissociate from your Dalitness to some extent. So And there's, I mean, different ways in which people did that. So there's also young women that were part of the Ravidasya movement, which is a caste-based religious movement. And so they were also claiming their caste identity in ways that elevated status. So class was a huge part of how they dealt with their caste identity. In fact, young women primarily did not talk to me about caste. So it's almost like the discussions about caste were primarily centered when I was talking to the older men. But the young women were much more invested. And of course, this with ethnographic fieldwork, there's a lot to do with your own positionality and what the participants want to project to you. So they were a lot more interested in talking to me about their plans for the future and what so their aspirations and plans were the primary sort of focus of discussions. And so, you know, caste would come up every now and then, but it was not something that they seemed very concerned about. So I think for them, and this is particularly true of, it's not true of all lower caste communities by any means, but within this particular community, and especially upwardly mobile lower caste communities, there is a way in which, and there's a lot of work on this as well, that tries to talk about how upwardly mobile lower caste communities navigate their caste identity. And there's, you know, different ways which that happens, but it seemed to be that, you know, class mobility was a way for them to overcome caste, at least for the young women. I think it's very different for the young men and for the older men. But for the young women, you know, their projects were much more centered around this idea of gendered forms of empowerment and, you know, how they can access these aspirational spaces and what that means for their identities. So that seemed to be their primary preoccupation. But again, I don't sort of make this claim because I think it needs a lot more data, but that is something that I found in my field site specifically, that class mobility in some senses is overriding the concerns with caste, at least in this particular community with the young women.
Really interesting. Thank you all so much for the fantastic presentations and also fantastic responses to that really interesting set of questions. I found the two sessions so enriching myself. And yes, Seb, I agree, they're far too short, but I hope that we can find ways to continue the conversations, and we don't need to see this as the kind of end of sharing ideas and continuing to talk about these, what I think are absolutely fascinating and really important issues. So thank you so much to everyone. Elaine, I don't know if you want to say anything before we all sign off.
No, just to echo thanks. I just want it to carry on. There's so much to talk about, and hopefully, as you say, we should try and structure a way of keeping in touch and continuing to learn more about each other's work. That would be great.
And just a very quick plug before we go, I think Annika and Suganda both mentioned we've got an edited volume coming out on education, migration, developments that will be published in October. It will be available open access, so it will be free to access for anyone. But hopefully we might be able to have some kind of event around that and be able to let you all know about it.
Great.